You're standing in the dusty fields of Camp Fannin, Texas, 1945, and something extraordinary is about to unfold before your eyes. Picture this. Thousands of German prisoners of war, men who fought for the Third Reich, are being told they can finally go home. The war is over. Germany awaits. But here's what nobody expected. Many of them looked their American captors in the eye and said no. They refused repatriation. They wanted to stay in Texas. And the reason why will completely rewrite everything you thought you knew about World War II. You see, the story begins 3 years earlier, in 1942, when the first German POWs started arriving on American soil. The U.S. government faced an unprecedented challenge. What do you do with hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers? The solution was brilliant in its simplicity: scatter them across rural America, far from the coasts, far from strategic targets. Texas, with its vast open spaces and agricultural needs, became home to more POW camps than any other state. Over 50 camps dotted the Lone Star landscape, holding nearly 50,000 German prisoners. But you need to understand what these men were expecting when they arrived. They'd been fed years of Nazi propaganda about Americans' tales of a brutal, uncultured people who would torture and execute prisoners. Many of these soldiers boarded ships to America, genuinely believing they were sailing toward their deaths. Imagine their shock when they stepped off those trains in places like Hearne, Mejia, and Huntsville to find something completely different. What they found was warmth, hospitality, the famous Texas spirit that locals still talk about today. You have to picture the contrast. These men came from a Germany that was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Their cities were rubble. Their families were starving. Food was rationed to near starvation levels. And suddenly, they're in Texas, where the Geneva Convention guaranteed them the same rations as American soldiers. They were eating better than they had in years, better than their families back home. 3 full meals a day, fresh vegetables, meat, real coffee. For many, it was the first time they'd felt truly fed since before the war. But the food was just the beginning of what would become an unlikely love story between German POWs and Texas. You see, the camps weren't brutal detention centers. They were more like small towns. The prisoners worked, yes, but they were paid for their labor. 80 cents a day in scrip that they could spend at camp canteens on cigarettes, toiletries, even beer. They played soccer. They formed orchestras and theater groups. They built churches and celebrated Christmas. Many were allowed to work on local farms and ranches, side by side with Texans who were desperately short on labor because so many American men were overseas fighting. And this is where the story gets really interesting. These young German soldiers, many barely out of their teens, started interacting with local communities in ways that would have been unthinkable in a conventional war scenario. The strict rules against fraternization began to blur at the edges. Farm families would invite POW work crews to Sunday dinners. Local women would attend the camp concerts and theatrical productions. Despite the language barriers, despite the fact that these men had been enemies just months before, human connections started forming. You need to understand the demographics at play here. Small Texas towns during the war were populated primarily by women, children, and older men. The young American men were all in Europe or the Pacific. These communities were starved for male companionship, for help with heavy labor, for the energy that young men bring to a place. And suddenly, here were thousands of young German men, polite, hardworking, often well-educated, and genuinely grateful for the treatment they were receiving. The romance stories that emerged are almost too perfect to be true, except they are true. In towns like New Braunfels and Fredericksburg, which had large German-American populations dating back to the 1800s, the cultural connection was even stronger. Many local families still spoke German at home. They understood the culture, the customs, the mentality. For the POWs, it must have felt like finding a piece of home in the most unexpected place. Take the story of Friedrich, composite of many real prisoners whose stories have been documented. Friedrich was a farmhand from Bavaria who'd been conscripted into the Wehrmacht at 19. He'd fought in North Africa, been captured by British forces, and eventually transferred to American custody. He arrived at Camp Mejia in 1943, expecting the worst, and found himself assigned to work on a cotton farm owned by a widow named Mary Henderson and her daughter, Sarah. Mary's husband had died before the war, and her sons were fighting in Europe. She desperately needed help bringing in the harvest. Friedrich worked that farm for 2 years. He learned English from Sarah, who was 22 and had been teaching at the local schoolhouse. They'd talk during water breaks, sitting under the shade of live oak trees, him teaching her German words, her correcting his English pronunciation. By all accounts, they fell genuinely in love, a love that transcended the absurdity of their situation. He was a prisoner of war. She was the daughter of his employer. His country was fighting against hers. None of it should have worked, but somehow it did. Now multiply that story by hundreds, maybe thousands. Because when the war ended in May 1945, and the U.S. government began the massive undertaking of repatriating prisoners, something unexpected happened. Many German POWs simply didn't want to leave. They'd petition camp commanders with every excuse imaginable. They'd claim health problems. They'd argue they had skills needed for the harvest. Some even tried to hide when repatriation lists were posted. You have to understand what they'd be returning to. Germany in 1945 was an apocalypse. Berlin was 90% destroyed. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, ancient cities reduced to wastelands of rubble. The economy had completely collapsed. There was no food, no housing, no jobs. Millions were displaced, wandering across a devastated landscape looking for family members who were often dead. The country was divided between Allied occupation zones, with the Soviet zone in the east already showing signs of the brutality that would characterize communist rule for the next 45 years. Compare that to Texas, where these men had spent years living in relative comfort, eating well, working meaningful jobs, and forming genuine relationships with local communities. Many had promised to return to women they'd fallen in love with. Others had simply fallen in love with Texas itself, the wide open spaces, the entrepreneurial spirit, the sense of possibility that existed even in small towns. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because U.S. law at the time made it nearly impossible for them to stay. The government was under immense pressure to send all POWs home as quickly as possible. American soldiers wanted to come home themselves, and keeping German prisoners on American soil, while U.S. troops remained overseas, was politically untenable. By the end of 1946, almost all German POWs had been forcibly repatriated. Even those who begged to stay. The separations were heartbreaking. Friedrich and Sarah's story didn't end happily, at least not immediately. He was shipped back to Germany in late 1945, back to a Bavaria that existed only in memory. His family's farm had been destroyed. His father was dead, killed in an Allied bombing raid. His mother and sister were living in a refugee camp. The girl he'd known before the war had married someone else. There was nothing left of the life he'd once had. But Friedrich, like hundreds of other former POWs, never forgot Texas. He never forgot Sarah. And as soon as it became possible, as soon as the U.S. began allowing German immigration again in the late 1940s and early 1950s, he found a way back. He wrote letters, filled out forms, waited years for approval. And in 1952, 7 years after he'd been forced to leave, Friedrich stepped off a train in Mejia as a free man. 3 months later, he and Sarah were married. They bought a small farm. They raised 4 children. Friedrich became an American citizen. He lived in Texas until his death in 1997, and according to his obituary, he never once regretted his decision to return. His story wasn't unique. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, a steady stream of former German POWs made their way back to Texas and other states where they'd been imprisoned. Some came for the women they'd loved. Others came for the economic opportunities. Many came simply because they'd been treated with more dignity and respect as prisoners in America than they'd ever experienced as soldiers in Germany. They became farmers, mechanics, teachers, businessmen. They integrated into their communities so thoroughly that within a generation, few people remembered they'd once been enemy soldiers. The full scope of this phenomenon has never been completely documented because many of these men and the families they married into preferred not to advertise their histories. Being a former Nazi soldier, even if you'd been conscripted against your will, even if you'd fought reluctantly, carried a stigma. Many changed their stories, claiming they'd come to America as regular immigrants. Their children often didn't learn the truth until they were adults. But the evidence is there if you know where to look. Census records show clusters of German-born men in Texas towns that housed POW camps, men who arrived in America in the early 1950s and married local women. Oral histories collected by local historical societies contain dozens of stories about the German POWs who came back. Church records document marriages between former prisoners and Texas women. The paper trail exists, scattered across dusty archives and family attics. What makes this story so fascinating is what it reveals about human nature and the arbitrariness of war. These men were supposed to be enemies. They'd been drafted into Hitler's army, taught to believe in German superiority, sent to fight for a cause that would become synonymous with evil. But stripped of uniforms and propaganda, imprisoned far from the war's brutality, they turned out to be just men capable of kindness, hard work, love, and building new lives in unexpected places. The Texas towns that housed these camps were transformed by the experience too. Many residents who'd initially been fearful or hostile toward the German prisoners came to see them as individuals rather than enemies. The experience challenged their assumptions, broadened their perspectives. Some of the strongest advocates for allowing POWs to return and immigrate were the very families who'd employed them during the war. This isn't a story you'll find in most history books about World War II. It doesn't fit the neat narrative of good versus evil, allies versus Axis, victory and defeat. It's messy and complicated and deeply human. It's about how people adapt to circumstances, how proximity and shared work break down barriers, how love emerges in the most unlikely situations, and it forces you to confront uncomfortable questions. If these German soldiers could become beloved members of Texas communities, what does that say about the nature of enemy combatants? If American civilians could befriend and even fall in love with men who'd fought for Nazi Germany, what does that say about our ability to demonize entire populations during wartime? The story refuses simple answers. Today, scattered across Texas, there are families with German surnames and unlikely origin stories. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of men who came to Texas as prisoners and stayed by choice. Most of them know their family histories, though not all share them publicly. The POW camps themselves are mostly gone dismantled after the war, the land returned to other uses. But in places like Hearne and Mejia, small museums preserve artifacts and stories from that unusual chapter of history. The lesson, if there is one, might be this, that even in the midst of history's darkest chapters, human connection persists, that people are more than their nationalities, their uniforms, their government's ideologies, that a young German farmhand and a Texas schoolteacher could find love despite everything that should have kept them apart. that men who'd been trained as enemies could become neighbors, friends, husbands, fathers. Americans dot, so the next time you're driving through rural Texas and you pass an old-timer with a German surname and a thick Texas drawl, consider asking about his family's history. You might just hear one of the most remarkable and least known stories to come out of World War II, the story of the German POWs who refused to go home because they'd already found it in the most unexpected place imaginable.